In the twilight of a world, one that can no longer imagine anything new for itself as it has constricted itself from doing so, an aging poet puts forth a kernel. Though his contemporaries are content with recreating the motions of their forefathers until the end of time, he instead seeks to pervert and distort their image in one last bid to try to make something new. He pulls on that fundamental truth of humanity which guides all things, love, and shapes from it an alien environment unlike anything the myths of old have ever found themselves in. The tension between these two forces then goes on to define the work itself. These heroes have been retold in so many forms and shapes that they have lost all their character, and so they can only be taken as farces, made to run around in shadow play so the soul of the text can be unveiled. It is romantic, it is cynical, it is what the poet tried to slide through the cracks of the door of culture and history before it closed. This is the tale of that forgotten poem. It is a tale of love. Of course, one may be scratching their head at some kind of literal assertion that Super Paper Mario is the last video game ever produced. After all, you may have noticed that in the time since April 9th, 2007, there have been a multitude of games released. That, however, is not the idea being pushed forward here. Instead, Super Paper Mario is representative of the totalistic endpoint of forward momentum for games as a medium, everything after repeating the same points in repetition. In truth, there is no perfect cutoff for this idea, but Super Paper Mario feels particularly fitting as such. It is a text that could only be produced by those specific conditions, after all. By 2007, the 7th generation of video games had begun. The 6th generation of video games had revealed the facade of the console cycle for what it was. It mechanically did not develop beyond homogenizing control schemes. It also finally cemented franchises as the main artistic driving force in games. While video games had been highly franchised as a medium ever since the mid-1980s, one can thank Super Mario Bros. For that nightmare. The 6th generation saw endless spin-offs for endless mascots and icons in an attempt to turn any characters they could into home names that could then be mined for even more games and ideas. In fact, once again, the portly plumber's head sticks above the crowd as a noteworthy example. Nintendo's 6th generation console, the GameCube, which was only supported for the span of 4 years, featured 21 different Mario outings, including 4 separate entries in the Mario Party sub-series. This isn't even counting the amount of titles that were Mario-themed on the Game Boy Advance, which remarkably managed to include yet another Mario Party game in their ranks. One of these GameCube titles, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, feels uniquely resentful of this deluge of spin-offs, presenting Mario and his cohort in a sardonic world full of distaste for and apathy toward them. Regardless of whether or not that game is successful at weaving that particular atmosphere, it was apparent that Mario was at a point that all franchises must contend with eventually: self-parody. One can only maintain something for so long before it becomes an expected joke, after all. As a sequel, Super Paper Mario makes some bizarre and distinctive changes to what its Paper Mario predecessors led players to expect. Gone are fully 3D environments and turn-based battles punctuated by perfunctory action commands. Instead, the world is rendered in 2-ish dimensions, with action platforming as the focus of the combat. In theory, this is more ludicrously close to conventional understandings of Mario than Paper Mario has ever been, a form of kowtowing to tradition. In practice, however, it ends up creating a distinct rhythm that belongs to neither world. the platforming does not enjoy the fruits of the design ethos that Mario has held for several decades since his outing on the family computer, and instead feels constrained by expectation, both in its duty to the history of Mario and the RPG elements expressing a need to be freed from those constraints, in a constant tug-of-war that makes everything feel lethargic. It is a dialectic of reverence and irreverence, a self-parody constructed from the images of self-respect. It constantly pays homage to the well-known tenets of Super Mario Bros., invokes the sprites and the play space of them, and even has esoteric references to techniques like infinite points exploits, but it is almost always purposeless and empty. The gigantic, mythic transformations into the literal 8-bit sprites as they were displayed in Super Mario Bros. Are moments that are almost entirely inconsequential, and, for whatever reason, the mechanic disappears almost entirely, not even halfway into the game. The infinite point exploit mentioned prior goes into the negative if utilized, forcing the player character to work harder to gain their points back as a joke at the expense of that nostalgic image. Most of the play experience even is doing repetitive busy work for the sake of characters who are overly hostile and demeaning, going so far as to have an entire level dedicated to getting a roll of toilet paper for some singing alien Frenchman. The universe, a divine comedy featuring the icons of the Super Mario Bros. Franchise made to be nothing, even as they are the supposed heroes chosen to save the universe. This text will not touch on the literal divine comedy of Super Paper Mario, where our poor players are made to climb from Inferno to Paradiso, much as it is the predilection of this channel, but instead it will touch on the ultimate truth expressed at the end of that poem. Namely, that ultimately at the core of all the jokes and jabs of the legacy of Super Mario Bros. Throughout the game, there is a sincerity underneath. One cannot have irony, that piercing of the veil, without some truth beneath. Otherwise, it is simply pure nihilism. Super Paper Mario's true narrative centers on two star-crossed lovers finally finding each other again in the face of the end of the world, one brought to such despair in the absence of the other that he saw it fit to end all life. It is the most high-stakes, sentimental narrative possible, and its juxtaposition against the generally low-key Mario makes for an interesting take on the series. For once, the plumber and his pals have to believe in something more ancient and unknowable than themselves, and sacrifice their egos to do it. The long-standing franchise traditions of 20 years don't hold a candle to love itself, beating against all the cynicism and all the embedded rot that Mario is representative of. Mario and his friends make it out of the story unscathed, but they are not the focus. In fact, they are powerless against the ultimate end of all worlds. It's only the reuniting of the tragic lovers, and their absolution even in death, that ultimately stays the power of entropy. It is a beckon to forget stewing in the franchise, lest we succumb to a state where video games no longer progress. Yet it is not even the game's strongest allusions to these ideals. In 1945, as it has been discussed many times by myself and many others over the near 100 years of history since, the Empire of Japan was defeated at the end of the Second World War. This was due to a number of factors, some of which true and others American propaganda. One element of it that is elements of both fiction and fact to it is that the Japanese were very bogged down by their commitment to traditions, but it was less so that this lost them the war during its duration, and more so that it motivating them to enter the war in the first place is what doomed them. After a series of successful imperialist and warmongering campaigns throughout the Pacific Ocean during the early 20th century, Japan figured it could take its expansion further and entered World War II. After all, it had defeated a force as strong as the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. What did it have to fear at this point? That drunkenness on the cultural narrative of Japan's total superiority and divine right to empire led to them taking on larger enemies than they could contend with, the United States and the Soviet Union, and that ultimately led to their destruction via war crimes themselves, just like the ones that they had committed, if not in content, then in cruelty and senselessness. It is these realities that informed the 6th chapter of Super Paper Mario, which features the protagonists venturing to a land based in the Japan of myth in ersatz reconstruction that feels like a cartoon parody of an Akira Kurosawa or a Kenji Mizoguchi film. It is in this distorted kabuki theater that we are introduced to the samurais and their plight. Their world is soon to end, and could possibly be saved if Mario would intervene. Unfortunately, they are bound by tradition to a lengthy practice of pointless bloodshed, which stalls Mario from being able to retrieve the artifact that is the reward at the end. Ultimately, the entire universe is destroyed in atomic fury, and the image of Japan that once was can no longer be remembered. It falters in the face of postmodern violence, of apocalyptic weaponry that exists beyond truth or reason. The empire crumbles, the last few samurais even recognizing the total absurdity of it all. They are doomed, and so their ambitions are crushed in a horrifying moment of unimaginable destruction, fit to doom all living things so long as it exists. So ends the legacy of Shinobi. Of course, this through line exists all throughout the game, even as this is the biggest central example of it. The flower people of prehistory are so enshrined in their hierarchical values that they are ultimately defeated by the class that they oppressed and tortured on a systematic level. And though I said we wouldn't speak on it, you shouldn't have trusted me to not make some remark on Dante when he's in the room with us. The very fundamental structures of the cosmic order and heaven and hell must be moved in order to save the day in the game's penultimate excursion. The Godhead and Hades come together in love where there was once a rift keeping them apart. Time and time again, adherence to embedded ideologies and traditions ends in ruin for those who participate in it, with love and acceptance of this forbidding new and all its calamity and ecstasy being the only things that can bring peace and fulfillment to the worlds that the cast of characters visit and exist within. So that is perhaps what is meant when it is said that Super Paper Mario is the last video game. It is certainly not the last one to be developed, and not the last one to ever be played. In fact, I would hardly even say it was the last good video game. There are plenty of texts from after its release that are excellent. It is, however, a conclusive note to a uniquely explosive and innovative period of artistic development for games as an art form. For the first 50 years of their existence, video games had experienced so much innovation. And Super Paper Mario saw those doors closing in on it off the heels of a period of intense franchisation and hegemonic normalization of control schemes and displays and ways of making games. Is it tragic? Perhaps, but one must remember the height of the Renaissance itself was only a mere 50 years, or so most scholars agree. It seems to be the course of human history for these explosions to happen whenever new modes of expression are discovered. Though it's depressing, it is inevitable. Super Paper Mario pleads for love beyond the world that it was made for, but the gong sounds, and the door closes, and it is alone, unloved, unwanted in spite of its depths and complexities. It's a beautiful isolation it experiences, though, unloved at the end of its medium. at the end of its time. Perhaps in some 100 or 500 or 1,000 years it'll be discovered again. And then, and only then, it'll herald in some new age for those robotic rabbits that speak of the exploits of men, or whatever literature they write in the hopes of understanding the sapiens that came before them. Or maybe it'll sit forgotten at the bottom of the well, never to be drawn up with the rain and exposed to the light of dawn. Regardless of what happens, and to whom, it will be the last, and perhaps the first, video game.